So this repetitive behavior leads to a relief of anxiety in this individual. Once he has taken alcohol, 4 to 6 units, the anxiety comes down. And now this repetitive behavior becomes an obsessive phenomenon. The individual knows that he does not need to drink, but then he has to drink. Now the physical dependence takes over and withdrawal symptoms start. So now it becomes an obsession. He has to take, otherwise the withdrawal will occur or the anxiety will increase because of the stress. And then the anxiety sets in again, and then again it becomes a cycle. So a condensation of this part, these two cycles, is this addiction cycle. Here I have labeled it differently. You must have seen it in the books also. There is initially a binge intoxication stage where the individual tends to lose control. He takes a lot of the drug and then causing an intoxication. I would like to tell you, for alcohol, a binge is using 5 units in a session or within 2 hours. So he goes on a binge, and when it becomes a regular occurrence, physical dependence sets in, the person goes into withdrawal / a negative effect stage. And that's because there's a negative effect, he takes again, and gradually the drug takes salience in his life. It becomes the most important thing to him rather than his books, his school, his hobbies, his workplace, his children, his wife. He becomes preoccupied with alcohol, which is the preoccupation / anticipation stage. Now we can also learn it using the learning theory. So how does that happen? Initially, when the individual starts to drink, he gets pleasure out of it. There is a kick, as they say. So this gives rise to positive reinforcement. So the individual drinks whenever he wants pleasure. The pleasure is conditioned with the drink, which is the unconditioned stimulus. But then gradually, when he keeps on drinking, this positive reinforcement goes down. And when then the withdrawal starts happening, he has to take the drink because of the negative reinforcement, right? So when the withdrawal occurs, he has to drink, he gets relief. When he doesn't drink, again the withdrawal occurs. So initially, when he wanted to drink because he used to like it, now he has to drink because he has to stave off the negative effect or the withdrawal. So they say that it is basically a reward deficit disorder, because the individual is not getting enough reward or enough pleasure from other things in life. That's why he becomes vulnerable to addictive disorders. Now, this vulnerability can come from genetic factors and environmental factors that we'll discuss later, why this reward deficit comes in. So again, here, this is the stages of addiction. Now, here I have put in the few areas of the brain. So in the binge intoxication stage, there is a lot of dopamine secretion in the reward pathway. You know, the reward pathway is from the amygdala, from the VTA, that is the ventral tegmental area, into the nucleus accumbens. This is the reward center. So when there is a lot of dopamine secretion in nucleus accumbens, that gives the sense of pleasure to all of us. So this is where the binge intoxication stage lies. Then comes the negative effect stage, where there is a reward deficit or a stress surfeit. Here, the negative effect arises because of problems in the amygdala. This is the extended amygdala, which gives rise to the negative effect stage. I'll discuss it further. And then comes the preoccupation anticipation stage. Here, it is there in the prefrontal cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex, which gives rise to motivation to drink further, right? So the individual gets motivated to drink again and again. think about the alcohol all the time. And this is the property of orbitofrontal cortex, which gives rise to the motivation to take the drug. So this is the dopaminergic system that is involved in addiction. This is the ventral tegmental area. This is, as you know, the striatum, the substantia nigra. So basically the reward pathway is, there is dopaminergic neurotransmission from the ventral tegmental area into the nucleus accumbens. Whenever the dopamine rises in nucleus accumbens, we feel pleasure. Now, this is only one part of it. Usually all the drugs, all the psychoactive substances, they finally act on the opioid receptors. I'll be coming to that. So the opioid receptors are the ones which are the final common pathway for feeling pleasure. And these opioid receptors, when they act on the ventral tegmental area, the opioid receptors are there on the ventral tegmental area. These, when open up, this gives rise to around an increase of about 400% increase in dopaminergic neurotransmission into the nucleus accumbens. And that is what gives rise to the sense of pleasure. Now, this sense of pleasure can be taken from natural rewards, like food. If you see biryani, there is a lot of dopaminergic transmission here. When you eat the biryani, the dopaminergic transmission further increases. Now, another natural reward is sex, right? Sexual orgasm causes an increase in dopaminergic transmission. Other behavioral aspects of this reward is coming first in the class, getting the first position in, say, NEET. That itself gives a lot of pleasure. But in patients who are prone to addiction or addicted to drugs, this natural rewards do not lead to an increase in the dopaminergic transmission as much as others. That is why we call it a reward deficit disorder. So what are the neural substrates of these three stages? So first is the binge intoxication stage, when the individual starts to drink heavily but occasionally. Initially, there is an activation of the opioidergic system. There are many opioid receptors. These basically, the opioid receptors are the interneurons from GABA, from nicotinic receptors. These opioid the afferent fibers, they are basically the interneurons which secrete opioids, that is the endogenous opioids. This leads to hedonistic pleasure. When the opioid receptor is stimulated, this gives rise to the pleasure that we seek. Now, these opioid receptors lead to an increase in the mesolimbic dopamine. Mesolimbic means from the midbrain to the nucleus accumbens. So this leads to the motivation to take the drink again. So the pleasure is here. The motivation to take again lies here. So initially, what is liking? I like my drinks. It starts off initially in adolescents or young adults. Say, today we'll have a drink. So he drinks 4 units, he feels very happy, and then he goes back to work. But gradually, as the dopamine keeps on increasing, the motivation keeps on increasing to take the drink again and again. And finally, when it becomes physiological oblique, the physical dependence, that's where the wanting comes in. Now he has to drink. Now he wants to drink because there is a lot of withdrawal, there is a lot of negative effect, there is a lot of craving. So the conversion of liking into wanting is the one which is the transition from occasional drinking, social drinking, to dependence or addiction. Now, This dopaminergic transmission also causes a conditioning towards drug-related stimuli. From motivation comes also learning. So the individual learns, the brain learns that this glass is associated with alcohol. This cigarette is associated with cannabis, or the cigarette foil is associated with heroin. When the conditioning occurs, even the sight, when the person sees the cigarette foil, that leads to an increase in dopamine in the reward pathway, which leads to increased craving. Now, as the person becomes dependent, there is a decreased activity of the dopaminergic system during the period of withdrawal or protracted abstinence. Even if the abstinence period is very long, say 5 years or 10 years, the activity of the dopaminergic system still remains in a deficit. So that after 10 years, if the patient goes back to drinking, it's highly likely that he will develop dependence features within the next 1 year. That's why we say that the reward deficit lasts forever. The neuronal architecture changes because of this dependence. That's why we say that dependence is a lifetime illness. So again, I want to show you that this is the ventral striatum. That is the caudate and the putamen, and the head of the caudate has the nucleus accumbens. This is the amygdala, and we don't consider amygdala as a separate entity these days. We call it the extended amygdala. So the extended amygdala consists of the amygdala, the substantia innominata in between, and this is the BNST, that is the bed nucleus of striatum terminalis. So this is the one which gives rise to the withdrawal/negative effect. Prefrontal cortex is the one which gives rise to the motivation to drink further, right? Again, insulary cortex also gives rise to the anticipation or the preoccupation stage. So what are the neural substrates for withdrawal or negative effect stage? Now here comes the function of the extended amygdala. Now there are two kinds of brain stress systems which can perpetuate the drug use. Whenever the individual is under stress, the drug use will increase. This is called allostasis. One is homeostasis, with the natural equilibrium in the body is called the homeostasis. Whereas when there is an artificial homeostasis produced by some psychoactive substance, there is some allostatic load which comes in. There is a change in the neuronal architecture to accommodate this use of alcohol, which is called allostasis. Now, if the allostatic load increases further, the individual is unable to cope with it, which leads to withdrawal symptoms. Now, the brain stress systems which are there are one, the extended amygdala, which I just showed you, and the other one is the HPA axis, that is the hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal axis. You already know that HPA axis is concerned with the stress system. That is, cortisol is produced under the effect of ACTH and CRF, that is the corticotropin releasing factor, which has a stress response. You know the stress response by Selye. So because of this extended amygdala, a fear conditioning sets in. When there is a dysfunction in amygdalary neuronal network, that gives rise to a lot of anxiety. Now, this anxiety is also related to the norepinephrine system, the locus coeruleus. This is connected to this. The extended amygdala is connected to norepinephrine. The norepinephrine gives rise to withdrawal. That is the autonomic hyperactivity, tachycardia, raised BP, tremulousness. And the fear conditioning gives rise to the startle reflex, the psychological symptoms of anxiety. Now, this extended amygdala also has got the ability to cause an elevation in CRF secretion. That is the corticotropin releasing factor. This is because of the dysregulation of the extended amygdala. Now, this CRF acts on the norepinephrine system to cause withdrawal. So, alcohol acts on the extended amygdala and the HP axis. The extended amygdala. Extended amygdala, there is a dysregulation in that, leading to an elevated CRF and fear conditioning. CRF causes an increase in the norepinephrine secretion, leading to withdrawal. Now, why do we say CRF is involved here? Because using animal studies, when we gave CRF antagonist to these rats which were dependent on alcohol, these drugs caused a blockage in the reinstatement to alcohol drinking. These rats, they stopped taking alcohol. There are a number of animal models for alcohol dependence. One of them was when a CRF antagonist was introduced in this extended amygdala, it blocked the reinstatement of alcohol use in the rats. There is the neural substrates for preoccupation oblique anticipation stage. Now the prefrontal cortex is responsible for inhibition response, that is the go-no-go, and the executive functioning. Now alcohol leads to certain gray matter deficits in the prefrontal cortex. There is a decrease in baseline activity in the orbitofrontal cortex. This orbitofrontal cortex is responsible for the motivation to take alcohol. That is the salience attribution. Salience attribution is attributing importance to a particular thing. Say if I am attributing salience to my studies, I will study more. I will be motivated to study more. But when we attribute more salience to alcohol, this will lead to more alcohol drinking. So there is a dysregulation of the orbitofrontal cortex because of alcohol, plus the anterior cingulate cortex, which is responsible for the inhibitory control, whether to go or not to go. You must have done many frontal lobes tests. One of the tests is inhibitory control or error monitoring. So this inhibitory control gets dysregulated, because of which the individual goes for binge drinking oblique regular drinking. So where does this vulnerability comes from? This vulnerability comes from the genetic environment, that is the internal environment, and the social environment, that is the external environment. Genetic environment is the DNA with which we are born with. This DNA we get from our parents, from our father and mother. Our father and mother get their DNA from their parents. So if the father or the grandfather or the father's brothers and sisters or the mother's brothers and sisters, they are having some form of psychoactive dependence, they transmit this genetic liability, just genetic vulnerability, to the index individual. Plus the external environment which is there. Now, external environment consists of a lot of factors. The prominent among them is early childhood adversity. Whenever a child suffers through adversity in early ages, say the first 2 decades of life or first 1.5 decade of life, that leads to a vulnerability to addictive disorders and other psychiatric disorders. These two, genetic and the social environment, also lead to changes in the behavior of the individual. Say if this external environment was not as adverse, nutritional problems were not there, the behavior would have been different. Now, this behavior can be a high externalizing or a high internalizing behavior. The child is disinhibited. He's ADHD. He's got antisocial personality. That can be because of genetic or the external environment. Or he can be totally inhibited. He can be anxious. He can be depressed. So the behavior itself depends on the genetic and the social environment which is available to the individual or the child. The genetic factors, up to 40 to 60% of the heritability or alcohol dependence is because of genetics. That means in a sample population, the genetic factors will provide 40 to 60% in 40 to 60% of the vulnerability to addiction in these individuals. It does not mean that in this particular individual, there is a 60% chance of becoming alcohol dependent because his father was dependent on it. It doesn't mean that. Heritability always refers to a population. It doesn't refer to an individual. So there are many genes which are responsible for an increased vulnerability to addiction. A few are related to alcohol metabolism. As you all know, there is an alcohol dehydrogenase, there is an aldehyde dehydrogenase. So certain polymorphisms in this ADH1B oblique ADH1C enzyme, which corticosteroid receptor genes. These make people vulnerable to addictive disorders. Then genes related to behavioral differences. For example, the serotonin transporter gene or the opioid receptor gene. So these genetic factors provide half the vulnerability. The other half comes from the environment. So if the individual was not put in this environment, only the 50% vulnerability will be there in this population. So if the child is provided warmth, he is not exposed to trauma, is not exposed to adverse factors during the period when he is growing, possibly we can prevent him from having psychiatric disorders in the form of substance use. This is the importance of learning about the environmental factors. Now, the environmental factors start right from conception. The prenatal factors, for example, gestational depression, the prenatal in the mother, maternal depression. Maternal depression is a very common factor for the vulnerability to psychiatric disorders in the child. Early childhood adversity. Now, this can be nutritional. It can be trauma. It can be abuse. Now, abuse can be physical, mental, or sexual. A lot of childhood adversity occurs in our country, which make the child vulnerable to psychiatric disorders, particularly addiction. Now, these factors, prenatal factors or childhood adversity, they interact with the genetics, right? They interact with the genetic factors to give rise to these behaviors, high externalizing behaviors or high internalizing behaviors. Externalizing behaviors like conduct disorder, like oppositional defiant disorder, like ADHD, and other psychiatric disorders like depression, anxiety. So how do these genes, now genes are inside the body, the environment is outside. How do the genes interact with the environment to give rise to a vulnerability to addiction? Now here comes the role of epigenetic modifications. If you know, epigenetic modifications are those in which the DNA doesn't change, right? The DNA remains the same. The ATGCs which are there in the DNA, they remain the same. Only the tags which are attached to the DNA or the histone proteins which are there or the RNA that is there, those change a little bit. And these changes are because of the environment. The gene interacts with the environment to give rise to modifications in the DNA. but the DNA profile doesn't change. So there are certain tags which are attached to the DNA. For example, a methyl tag. There are other tags like phosphoryl tag, like acetyl tags, but the most important is the methyl tag. What does methylation do to these genes? For example, the serotonin transporter gene, or the brain-derived neurotropic factor, that is the BDNF, or the COM gene, What happens to these genes when they are methylated, when methyl tags are attached to the cytosines in these genes? The methyl tag gets attached to the cytosine. You know the nucleotides, which are ATGC. You can read it from your book. So what happens is the cytosine is methylated. Methyl tag is attached, which gives rise to silencing of these genes. These genes get silenced. That means the gene will not be expressed, the serotonin will not be formed. That's why we say, isn't it, when depression, there is a decrease in serotonin. Why does the serotonin decrease? Because of the gene-environment interaction, these genes get silenced. The serotonin is not produced, and this is what gives rise to depression, addiction, etc. Now there are histone proteins. The DNA is wrapped around the histone proteins. So these histones can also be tagged. For example, acetyl tags can be there, methyl tags can be there. The histone may be deacetylated or demethylated. That also gives rise to a change in the histone. And because of the change, the DNA, which is there, they tightly wrap around the DNA or they're loosely wrapped around the DNA. The chromatin is also different. Condensed chromatin, relaxed chromatin. So when the histone changes, they may be tightly wrapped around the DNA or loosely wrapped. If they're tightly wrapped, the gene will be silenced. If they're loosely wrapped, the gene will be expressed. Again, there will be a change in the neurotransmitter production or the neuropeptide production, which will give rise to behavioral changes or vulnerability to addiction or other psychiatric disorders. Now, coming back to addiction, we most commonly, the behavior which is there in any individual due to addictive disorders, what we encounter is usually craving. We always ask for craving in the individual. So where does craving arise from? Now I have this diagram. Craving can come from the amygdala. Craving can also come from the anterior cingulate gyrus or the orbitofrontal limbic system. So we can divide craving into different parts. One is craving due to the drug or the conditioned stimuli related to the drug, or it can be stress induced. So this one gives rise to the stress induced craving, and the drug induced craving is due because of the change in the dopaminergic state or the orbitofrontal cortex. So this is a graph that shows us the craving in alcohol patients, cocaine patients, or social drinkers. Alcohol, cocaine, and social drinking. So when there is a lot of stress, the peak alcohol cocaine induced craving, it rises. See, there is a lot of craving in alcohol and cocaine patients, dependent patients, not much in social drinking. Neutral conditions, there is no craving. When cues are provided, the craving shoots up. When he sees a liquor shop, the craving suddenly comes up. Now, this is the peak anxiety ratings during these conditions. When there is stress, the addicted patients show a lot of anxiety. Similarly, in drug cues, whenever they are presented, they cause a lot of anxiety. So, what happens in stress-induced craving? Whenever there is a stress, it increases the craving. So what happens? There are many vulnerability factors which I had just discussed, which can lead to dependence. Now, these vulnerability factors can be adverse events, trauma, chronic stress, poor executive functioning, trait impulsivity, genetic and familial factors, which will give rise to these changes whenever the substance is introduced. Now, it will cause an increase in CRF secretion. The CRF HPA responses will be dysregulated. There will be autonomic hyperactivity. Noradrenergic changes will be there. Dopamine changes will be there. And these will be modulated by these neurotransmitters. So what happens whenever a stress is there in a dependent patient? It will lead to this trait impulsivity will be enhanced. Behavior and emotional discontrol will be enhanced because of poor executive functioning. And whenever distress happens, again, these changes are further exaggerated, which gives rise to maladaptive behaviors like craving, distress, and an increase in drug use. So this is the model for stress-induced craving. Usually, the extended amygdala is the one which is responsible in stress-induced craving. Now, what happens in conditioned cue-induced craving or drug-induced craving? So whenever the individual sees those stimuli which are associated with a drug, or whenever he sees the drug, say a bottle of alcohol, what happens? Again, the conditioned reactivity is reintroduced. For example, these cues can be the site of the substance. Those typical substance-taking environments where the person used to take the substance. Even when he goes after 10 years to the same environment, that will cause an increase in the dopaminergic transmission in the nucleus accumbens, which will give rise to craving. It can even happen after 10, 20 years. The typical environment where substances can be purchased, for example, a liquor shop or the street where heroin can be bought. Advertisements. You know that advertisements related to liquor and cigarettes are banned in our country. Why? This has a scientific reason. It is because these are the cues that can give rise to craving in an individual who's already addicted. When they see other people administering those substances, for example, a syringe, a needle, if they see an injection being given, an intravenous injection, it will give rise to those cues and cue-induced craving. So what happens during this craving? A withdrawal-like response occurs. Even though individual is not taking the substance, withdrawal-like responses occur. They will have tachycardia, they will have tremulousness. Opponent process negative responses can be there. Again, it is related to the allostasis, the responses that used to occur in patients earlier when they were dependent on alcohol. Substance-like responses occur. For example, if he sees the bottle of alcohol, it will, the pleasure that he will get out of it is the same as if he was drinking the alcohol. So the positive response occurs. Some dopamine is secreted, which will, the person can relive the experience of taking the drug. So what happens when all this happens, reactivity happens, he will seek out and administer the substance, he will binge, and then finally he will relapse. So what happens when we treat the individual? So as we know, there is a lot of executive dysfunctioning that occurs. There is a dysfunction in the reward circuitry. There is a dysfunction in the stress circuitry. There is a lot of incentive salience. The liking has become wanting. And there is social isolation of the individual. So what happens when the individual is exposed to all these therapies? What are the therapies that we use? We use medication, that is anti-craving drugs. We use CBT, we use psychoeducation, we use MET, we use mutual help, say for example in Alcohol Anonymous. We use contingency management, what to do in a crisis state. What if I am invited to a place where alcohol is being served? And what do I do at that time? Do I drink? Or do I ask for help? Do I call up the psychiatrist? Do I call up the psychosocial worker? And exercise. So as you see here, there are certain places where one of the therapies act in all the places. One is anti-craving medication. And you see, surprisingly, mutual help. So Alcohol Anonymous does have a role. Even contingency management. So this stress circuitry, it may not act because nothing can help in that period of time except for CBT, medication, mutual help, right? So if we involve the patient in all these modalities of treatment, probably we'll be able to manage the dysfunction which has already developed in all these areas. So it is on not one treatment that will help the person. We usually think that if we prescribe naltrexone to the individual, it will help them. No. He'll not be able to take naltrexone. He will stop taking it because the reward circuitry is dysregulated. He will stop taking naltrexone. During periods of stress, he will stop taking naltrexone. But then if we use all these therapies, possibly the individual will be able to extend his abstinence for a longer period of time. And say if he's able to extend for up to 1 year, there will be some, although 90% of the people relapse in 1 year. That's why I'm saying at least 1 year, if he'll be able to abstain, then probably he'll be able to abstain for further. And if he's able to abstain for 5 years, then probably that abstinence period will be much longer. So how do these, knowing about the genetic differences and knowing about the craving related to them or executive function deficits, how does it help us? These help us in making tailor-made decisions, tailor-made therapies for these certain individuals. For example, if I know that this person is having this kind of a genotype, in his gene, he doesn't have a A at that point, he has a T. There is no adenine but a thymine. And this person will respond to naltrexone. So I'll give him naltrexone. If there is another person who doesn't have a T, he has a C, there is a cytosine in its place in the DNA, then I know that whenever there is a C, these people respond to topiramate. So I'll give him topiramate. So this is the pharmacogenetics involved in addiction. If you know the neurobiology, the DNA profile of the individual, the vulnerability factors, probably will be able to make a tailor-made therapy for these individuals so that their abstinence period will be a longer. You know that in Japanese people and in Asians, there is a particular polymorphism of ADH and ALDH. Now, this polymorphism leads to an increase in aldehyde secretion. You know, the alcohol is metabolized to aldehyde in the liver. So here the alcohol dehydrogenase, it's not working efficiently, or the aldehyde dehydrogenase is not working efficiently, leading to an excess of aldehyde in the blood. And this aldehyde causes a flushing reaction. There can be tachycardia, there can be vasodilatation, there can be anxiety, irritability increased. So that's why it has been seen in Japanese and other East Asian populations, the dependence is less. And why? Because this is the polymorphism that is found in these people. Second, there are a number of such polymorphisms and changes in the genes, but I have put a few. So this is the opioid receptor gene, that is the OPRM1 gene. Now it has been seen then that whenever a opioid receptor antagonist is given, say naltrexone. So when they gave naltrexone to rats, which were already dependent on alcohol, there was an OPRM1 receptor blockade. And then when this receptor was blocked, this prevented alcohol from inducing dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens. So this is how they found out that probably there is something in the OPRM gene which is making naltrexone work in alcohol dependence patients. So as I said earlier, the final pathway is through opioids. All the substances usually act through opioids, barring a few. There is another polymorphism of the OPRM1 gene, where at the 118th position in the DNA, in the gene, the A is replaced by G. adenine is replaced by guanine. So in the GG genotype, that is, in both the alleles, G is present. There is more dopaminergic transmission. So these GG genotype is more vulnerable to dependence, opioid dependence or alcohol dependence. And probably these people are more amenable to treatment with naltrexone. So if I come to know of the GG genotype, I can give him naltrexone because I know that naltrexone will work in this individual. But this is not so simple like this what I'm explaining. But still, we are very early in psychopharmacogenomics and probably will learn more in next few years. So this is all about the neurobiology of addiction. I have explained you the reward pathway, how the cycle of addiction comes in, what are the genetics involved, what are the brain areas which are involved in this, something about craving I mentioned, and finally the pharmacogenetic part of addiction. So I am finished. If there are any questions, you can ask now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anurag. Students, you may type your questions in chat box.
Thank you, Dr. Trimodi, for such a wonderful and lucid presentation. I think people would have understood what is the future in addiction holds. So I'll ask people to please ask question. This is a wonderful opportunity.
So somebody asked about this graph. So the question was, why is the anxiety peak more in the social drinkers? Okay. Okay. So it is more in the drug use. See here. So the thing with dependent patients is that they are more resistant. I would say the cortisol rise in these patients is not much. When the patient is exposed to a lot of childhood adversity, there is numbing of the cortisol response. That's why the anxiety doesn't increase that much. It is called blunting of the cortisol response. So that's why the anxiety is not increasing that much in these patients.
The second question is, why cannabis has more psychological dependence than physical?
Why does it have less physical dependence? I can tell you. See, cannabis, THC is more lipid soluble, right? So the half-life of THC in the body is very long. For a chronic user, can go up to 4 weeks, 28 to 30 days. That's why the withdrawal doesn't occur, because its half-life is very long. Any drug whose half-life is very long, the withdrawal doesn't occur. For example, in phloxetine, has got a very long half-life up to 7 days. Withdrawal doesn't occur because of serotonin withdrawal doesn't occur in phloxetine. That is why. I hope I have answered.
Any more question? People can unmute also and ask. If there are none, thank you, Dr. Anurag Trimodi, for such a wonderful lecture. I am sure that our students would have wonderfully gained from it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
So kind of you. I'll hand over to Mr. Navneet for final conclusion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Anurag, for your presentation. And thank you very much, Professor Jyoti Prakash, for joining us. And thank you, students, for joining us.
Haji.